Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I know some of you are joining us at what we call challenging time zones, but we're really pleased and glad that you're here. My name is Sheda Badi. I'm the Managing Director of Open Data Watch. My group is one of the co-sponsors of this webinar of the Gender Data Network. I tell you a little bit about Gender Data Network, but let me first to say how pleased we are to bring this webinar which is called The Hidden Power of Gender Data, Findings from ID Insights, DataDelta. Today's session, we're going to be structured in two segments. We'll have a presentation by the amazing team of the ID Insight, and I'm really, really looking forward to learning from the experts that we have. Followed by an interactive discussion with participants, and then we're going to have a closing by Sarah. Just remind you that we have interpretation. We have interpretation in, of course, French, because many of our GDN members are from French-speaking countries. But also just wanted to remind you that if you want to introduce yourself, use the chat to say who you are and from where you're calling, and then also use the chat for telling us any questions that you have for our speakers. Right after the interactive discussions, we'll open it up for question and answers, and really looking forward to hearing from you, because I know if you're here this morning to listen to this, you're experts and you want to learn from experts on the surveys and all kinds of innovative approaches on surveys and bringing gender and inclusivity to survey data collection. So looking forward to also hearing from our audience. Let me just tell you a few words about the GDN, Gender Data Network. Is a network that is started a few years ago, and we now have 44 countries that are members of the Gender Data Network. Is membership of the focal points from national statistical offices of experts and people who are working on gender data. So it's really a network of gender data people. So today's we all looking forward to learning from our experts from ID Insight and the DataDelta group. The sponsors of the GDN are Paris 21, Data2X, Economic Commission for Africa, and now recently the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, ESCAP, has joined us. So if we have any of the members, GDN members on board, please also welcome everyone and tell us who you are. I also want to special thanks to Jay and Miriam, our amazing coordinators of Gender Data Network, for organizing this webinar. So let me now pass it on to our first speaker, Sarah Lucas. Sarah is very close friend and colleague for many years, and she is the global director and lead for DataDelta to kick us off for today. Over to you, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. What a joy to be here. Thank you, Sheda, for the introduction, and thank you, GDN, for the invitation. My name is Sarah Lucas. I am the global lead for DataDelta at ID Insight. And while we're pulling up the slides, I just want to say that ID Insight is a global nonprofit organization. We have offices in many of the countries where you are represented. And the whole point of ID Insight is to support governments and nonprofits to have greater social impact by using data and evidence to inform their decision-making, to understand their context, and to achieve impact. DataDelta is a component of ID Insight. ID Insight works with partners around a whole range of evidence types. We can do impact evaluation, we can do monitoring systems, we can do data science projects, and DataDelta enables ID Insight to do large-scale survey data. So let's move forward a couple of slides to be able to show folks the key components of DataDelta. And DataDelta really has three components that sets us apart and enables us to make it faster and easier to collect data directly from human beings. You know, Shada mentioned the data revolution. She and I have worked together for a decade in the so-called data revolution. And so much of that revolution has been about getting information from people by being farther and farther away from them, whether it's remote sensing or inference or AI. And DataDelta is trying to use the innovation of that revolution to get closer and closer to people, make it faster and easier to get data directly from people. We do that through excellent data collection teams. You'll hear more about those today and how we are trying to make them more gender balanced. We do that through innovations in sampling to make it easier to reach to find hard to reach populations. You'll hear about that also today. And we also use SurveyStream, which is a custom-built software that streamlines our survey management and data collection and allows us to do real-time data quality monitoring and course correction while we're collecting data. Now, we use DataDelta in a lot of different ways. We help partners improve decision-making through large-scale surveys, to strengthen their own data systems and institutions, to ground truth, AI, and machine learning models. But the exciting part of DataDelta we're here to talk about today is how we use DataDelta to advance gender equity. That is the mission and the spirit of the GDN, and that's what we are here to talk about. We at DataDelta advance gender equity at 4 different levels. The first, as you're going to hear about from my colleague Disha, is around our survey methods and our sampling approaches. The second is around our field operations. You're going to learn today all the efforts we've taken to make more balanced teams so that we have greater representation from women in our enumeration teams and what that means for our data quality. You're also going to hear about how we take a gender lens to our data analysis, and you'll hear through the panel conversation some of the programmatic work we're doing to advance gender equity. So the run of show for today is I'm going to tell you a little bit, I'm going to ground our conversation and why gender data matters to all of us. I know you know this, but I'm just going to underscore it. Then I'm going to turn it to my colleagues to talk about the different pathways that DataDelta takes to advance gender equity. And then we'll have a panel discussion to dive a little bit more deeply into that. And then we'll open it up for your questions. So in terms of why gender data matters, you know, there's so many reasons, but I really break it down to 2. The first, as you'll see on the next slide, is around impact and equity. Lorraine, if you could just move this slide forward. Around impact and equity, we all know intuitively and through research and news and life experience that women experience the world differently, whether it's environmental impacts, climate change, violence, economic shocks. Women are experiencing things differently. Yet the data often don't reveal that because we don't collect the right indicators. I'm just wondering if, there we go, thank you. The chart on the left is data compiled by Open Data Watch, looking at 53 gender-sensitive indicators, gender-relevant indicators that are available by national statistical offices and other government offices. And this is a measure of availability. So you can see all the way on the left, when those slides return, that there is very little gender-relevant data available in some sectors, and there's more available in others. So some of the core areas like demography and migration, we have better indicators around women, but you can see that even in the best case, we're hitting about 50% availability about information about women. So what that means is that these issues, the differential experiences of women, go unseen, go unaddressed, and we actually perpetuate these problems by not having information and data about them. I wanted to highlight one standout example from India. There was a study in India recently of the 160 major government programs administered by the government of India at the state and national level. The government is collecting 1,600 indicators to track progress and to understand conditions in those programs. About half of those 1,600 are data specifically about program beneficiaries. 8% of those indicators are disaggregated by gender. So how can the Indian government know the experiences of the women in those programs or the impact that those programs are having on women? We are flying blind still today on issues of equity and impact around women. And then something near and dear to all of your hearts, of course, is the SDGs. We have we know hundreds of indicators around the SDGs, and I found this study from UN Women that was celebrating the progress that we had made from 2019 to 2022 on SDG indicators that are gender specific. And look at the progress. The blue bar is 2019, the yellow bar is 2020, and they were celebrating all the progress we've made in availability of gender specific SDG indicators. But if you look quickly at those numbers, they're all about 50%. So even today, just 6 years out or 8 years out from the end of the 2030 agenda, we only have half the indicators we need around women. So we are together in this problem, and I know that all of you as NSOs and civil society organizations working on this issue are trying to move the needle. So I just want to close by saying something about why you matter. You in NSOs matter on the next slide because you are collecting all the data and you are working every day to expand the data that we have access to. But there's two other important reasons. One is that as NSOs, you are standard-setting organizations, not only for your institutions, but for your governments across the board. Yet only 12% of NSDSs around the world mainstream and integrate gender throughout their strategies. And there are NSOs that are really trying to buck the trend here. This is an example from Kenya that has a new gender sector statistics plan. I know others of you are really pushing on this. Your thought leadership as NSOs is so important in improving our availability and use of gender data. I was thrilled to learn that INEGI in Mexico is one of the founding members and drivers of the Global Center of Excellence for Gender Statistics. These are NSOs that are really pushing the boundaries on gender data. And all of you, as part of the Gender Data Network, are doing just that. So we are thrilled to be here with you today. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to move beyond the why, which I know you share that passion with us, to the nuts and bolts of how we advance gender equity with data at ID Insight. So I'm turning first to Diksha Radhakrishnan. She is the lead for DataDelta in India, and she's going to kick us off on the first pathway to more gender intentional surveys. Over to you, Diksha.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. So before we go into the actual pathways to understand the how of, how do we go about actually conducting gender intentional surveys, I want to just zoom out and talk about what exactly are gender intentional surveys, right? So in a really simple format to say here, the gender intentional approach to surveying is collecting and measuring data in a way that minimizes any form of gender bias and actually reflects the true lived experiences of different genders. Here it says women, but of course, we want to look at all genders across. Now, we see that a lot of this doesn't actually end up happening, right? We know that a lot of the default survey tools and processes end up being, don't end up actually accounting for differences in gender experiences and the prevalence of gender bias. So this shift to actually moving to mechanisms which minimize this is important, but it doesn't always happen. And the reasons for that primarily are either lack of resources to be able to kind of go into, to actually take up these approaches, lack of knowledge on how do you actually go around integrating these kind of processes into your survey mechanisms, and thirdly, not appropriate prioritization, right? That, we don't see this as important enough, or policymakers are not prioritizing this enough. But as Sarah's already pointed out, taking a gender intentional approach is highly critical, because if we don't do that, a lot of the data which on the basis of which a lot of critical policy decisions are made without taking into account the specific needs of different genders and of women specifically. And then, of course, also sets us back in achieving the outlined SDG goals or other priorities at the national level. Next slide, please. So here, I think just summarizing what we've already discussed is that these are the three pathways we plan to talk about today. I do want to highlight one thing here, is that though we are speaking about these three pathways, this is not exhaustive. There are also other pathways here in terms of the ways we look at the theory of change of a program, the way we do indicator selection, but we've zeroed in on these three today just to help with, so that we are, talking about specific pathways that we have experienced firsthand and are able to kind of speak through specific case studies, etc. to you. Next slide, please. So specifically going into sampling approaches, which is what I will talk about right now, and then pass on to my colleague to talk about the other two approaches. When we talk about sampling, next slide, sampling is a critical method to ensure that the voices of women are accurately represented in data. By actively collecting data from diverse groups and understanding their needs, we can create policies that are equitable and just. Without inclusive sampling, certain groups get underrepresented, leading to biased results, and actually, help enhance inequalities that already exist. We all might know of experiences or examples, where we say how male bias data has resulted in the creation of non-exclusive policies or programs. Usually the seatbelt in cars are a good example of this, where a lot of the testing on seatbelts was done using primarily male groups, which is why seatbelts today are not specifically designed with women's anatomy and women's needs as well. And I'm sure there are other examples like public bathrooms, etc., that come to mind when we don't have inclusive sampling. Next slide.
Diksha, we have a request from the chat that you slow down a little bit. We have so many languages on the call.
Fair enough. I
Thanks.
will keep that in mind. Thank you. Now, creating representative and granular samples can be quite time-consuming. Most researchers end up relying on national census sample frames to conduct any kind of sample surveys. Now, most of these national census sample frames tend to be quite outdated or tend to have inherent biases. For example, in India, the last census was done in 2011. And hence, if we use that sample frame today, we know that it might not be actually reflective of the changing demographic of the country. Even when we use other available sample frames, right, like administrative data lists, we have concerns about whether they represent women adequately, because we know that women tend to be restricted in private spaces, in households, and they might not show up in a representative manner when we look at more administrative lists, like say school lists or bank, people who are banking, or in terms of, let's say, even when we think about how they're using social protection schemes, etc. Now, to address this very challenge, DataDelta has identified inclusive and representative sampling approaches, which can address both the cost and time inefficiencies by using these approaches. Now, the first one that we want to talk about is use of voter rolls. These are the lists of voters who participate in state and national elections. We basically scrape the data of voters from sampled polling stations and then are able to enroll and survey specific individuals from these lists. Now, in India, there have been concerted efforts to actually make the voter roll lists quite gender inclusive. For instance, in 2024 itself, when we had our national elections, there was a big push to increase the number of voters on these lists. And we see about, out of the 26.3 million voters that got added to the list, about 14.1 million of those were female voters, which surpasses the number of male voters by new male voters by about 15%. So we know these lists are more gender inclusive, and by using them, we are more confident in the sample frames that we built to be more gender inclusive. But these lists have only proven to be reliable in rural areas and less so in urban areas because of migration patterns in urban areas. So for urban areas, we instead use a different sampling frame, which is what we call the grid-based sampling. This involves obtaining a high-resolution population density map and dividing it into 30 by 30 or 100 by 100 meter grids. Then we estimate the population of each grid and conduct a listing exercise within these grids. And then within the households listed, we randomly select households for the survey. Now, by focusing on this smaller geographical area, we are cost effectively able to ensure that the full diverse population of those areas is well represented in the sample. The third approach is use of dual sample frames. So whenever we need to look at more specific subgroups of interest, we are able to use this method to especially enhance a representative sample by taking into account other administrative or programmatic lists and being able to then specifically target certain subgroups in this method. Now, to just give you a quick snapshot of how we've done this for a particular partnership with the state government. We had a partnership with the state government where the specific policy requirements needed us to have a sample that has female specific survey modules, represents household members by gender age, has specific submodules for interest groups like adolescent girls and boys, pregnant and lactating women. So to achieve these diverse requirements, which were necessary for the kind of policy decisions that the government partner wanted to make, we deployed the sampling strategies that I just spoke about, which included the use of voter rolls in rural areas, grid-based segments in urban areas, and then we also used 2 additional sample frames from health and education for the target groups of interest. So on my last slide, I'm going to show that by using the sample frame, what we were able to achieve. We were able to, achieve the kind of sample numbers that we had set out. And you can see that here we were able to interview almost 25,000 adult women, close to 10 and 11,000 women of subgroups of pregnant and lactating women. Overall, out of the 131,000 individuals that we surveyed, adult individuals that we surveyed, 50% or 49.8 to be precise, were women, which showed that we were able to have a really inclusive sample on this and then generate gender-specific insights for the partner, which was then able to help realize the specific policy needs and support the different subpopulations required. I will now pause here and hand over to my colleague Priyavi, who is an associate in ID Insight, and who will talk about how we can actually go about now the second pathway of hiring diverse field teams.
Diksha, so speaking about enumerator hiring, data collection at its heart is a conversation. It's a one-to-one conversation taking place at scale. As in the case of most conversations, who we are speaking with informs in some senses how we frame our responses to them. Similarly, in the case of data collection, how data is collected is informed by who collects that data. To collect data that is representative of the experiences, of the viewpoints of different genders, it is important to have enumerator teams which are also gender representative. At DataDelta, we conduct large-scale data collection projects across different regions, and we have observed the gender composition of our teams vary significantly from region to region. As you can see on the slide, in Philippines, most of our enumerators are women. Across the continent of Africa, we have a fairly gender-balanced enumerator team. And in India, we have a much more biased composition for our enumerator teams, with less than 25% of our enumerator teams comprising of women. Our primary motivation behind undertaking this analysis was to understand why is this the case and how we can improve the representation of women enumerators in our field teams in India. Moving on to the next slide. When we look at the gender composition of our field teams in India, the first obvious reason that comes to mind for the low representation of women is that we receive fewer applications from women candidates to begin with. This is not surprising, and it's very much in line with the female labor force participation in India. However, after speaking with our enumerators on the field, we started slowly understanding that maybe there are parts of our recruitment process that systematically disadvantage women candidates and make it more difficult for them to be recruited as enumerators. This was the starting point of our analysis, and we wanted to study different stages of our hiring process to exactly identify at which stages, if any, were we losing out on more women candidates and how we could improve on this. To quickly summarize our recruitment process, it's 3 stages. The first is an application form. This is where we collect data on their demographic details, name, age, gender, the district they're from, other information such as their educational qualifications, the languages they're familiar with, and work experience. Based on the form responses, we also here collect information about certain assets that they possess, as they make it more efficient it makes it more efficient for our teams to collect data. These include motorbikes for commute, driving licenses, also prior work experience and educational qualifications. Once the candidates are auto shortlisted based on prerequisites of the project, they're invited for an interview with our field manager, where we test for their acumen. Here we have questions on math, logical reasoning, case study based questions. And post this round, we invite the candidates for training. This is where we introduce them to the specific project they'll be collecting data for, the questionnaire, and we have quizzes to evaluate how much they're learning, and also field pilots to observe their performance, after which we finalize a final team. So here, if you can see, as we go from model 1 to model 2 to model 3, we relax some of our criteria in the first stage. We relax the prerequisite conditions that are required for candidates to be shortlisted. And as we move from stage 1 to stage 4, we go through the different stages of the process I just highlighted. Partly, as you can observe, it's true that we receive fewer applications from women candidates across all 3 models. We have made efforts over the past few years to improve this. So from 23%, we start getting applications from women candidates, which are closer to 34% of our candidate pool. This has been made possible by targeting women's colleges, targeting self-help groups, and other such fora to reach out to women residing in that area and looking for job opportunities. As we move to the first stage, the second stage, which is shortlisting for the interview, we observe that for 38% of the men who get shortlisted, only 13% of women do. As we reduce our prerequisite conditions, this sample becomes more equal. There's 30 to 24%, and there's 48 to 45% as we go on to relax these criteria. For interviews, this is not a stage. For both interviews and training performance, we see that these are not stages where women are systematically disadvantaged. In fact, they perform slightly better than their male enumerators, which shows that despite lowered qualifications, women demonstrate at least as much of an acumen and potential for performing well as enumerators as their more qualified male counterparts. Moving on to the next slide, we observe that just by reducing our considerations for their for our candidates access to assets, prior work opportunities, prior educational opportunities, we are able to hire more gender representative teams, with our most recent model, the third model, having an almost equal balance of male and female enumerators on our team. Moving on, an important question here to ask is that what happens? Like, we reduce these criteria, and these criteria are instituted for a reason. Like, they're instituted for reasons of productivity. They're instituted because we think educational qualifications and work qualifications are an important way to predict performance, either productivity or the quality of data that will be collected. And so if we reduce these criteria, does that have any implication on either of these things, on enumerator performance? We decided that, the next stage of our analysis should answer this exact question. Laureen, if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. We analyzed our enumerator performance on two criteria. First is productivity, which is how many surveys an enumerator is able to complete in a day. And we found that on average, women enumerators perform slightly better than their male counterparts. This is in both Model 2 and Model 3 as well, where we have reduced considerations of assets or prior opportunities. For data quality, we observed this for two sets of questions we thought were gender sensitive. With these examples are menstrual health, pregnancy care, prenatal health, sexual health, and non-gender sensitive. We also divided our respondent groups into adult male respondents and adult female respondents. We find that across all these different permutations and combinations, female enumerators perform at least as well as their male counterparts. In fact, on average, they perform slightly better. In the case of gender-sensitive questions to female respondents, the difference in the performance in the data quality collected by female enumerators is significantly better than that collected by their male counterparts. The difference in this case is of statistical significance, which goes on to show that despite reducing these criteria, it hasn't come at the cost of enumerator performance. The productivity and quality of data collected has remained at par as those when collected before, as those when collected by their male counterparts, who, based on our design, are on average more qualified than their female counterparts. Moving on to our last slide for this part of the presentation, our key takeaways from this. Our primary takeaway has been that this exercise has dissuaded us from instituting considerations of access as entry barriers for employment opportunities. This is particular to our case, but for most kinds of job opportunities, we institute some or the other kind of barrier as an entry barrier, like most common ones being educational qualifications, work experience. And while these are important, it has signaled to us the importance of sitting with it and truly investigating if it's necessary to institute them. The most important reason behind this investigation being that by instituting considerations of access as entry barriers, we risk perpetuating the very same social inequities that we seek to eradicate, considering that access in societies as hierarchical as most societies are is largely a function of one's privilege, one's position in one's society. On a corollary, relaxing these barriers has helped make our processes more fair. This is especially important when we take into the fact that despite lowered barriers, women enumerators perform at least well as their male counterparts. What we have learned is that even while operating in deeply unequal societies, it is possible to structure our internal processes of hiring, training, and performance management in ways that are equitable, in ways that allow us to identify and nurture acumen in candidates that barriers to access otherwise obscure. That was about our field teams. The second important question now becomes, once the data is collected, how is it analyzed? And I pass on to my colleague Mika to walk us through her presentation.
Thank you so much, Priyavi. So as Priyavi shared, like one of the other ways that DataDelta makes data more gender equitable is an analysis, and will be sharing our experience of doing gender disaggregated analysis in the Philippines. So back in 2022, the Department of Health commissioned ID Insight to conduct a 5-year panel study to collect data on knowledge, attitudes, and practices on 7 priority areas identified under the Health Promotions Framework Strategy. These health-seeking behaviors are diet and physical exercise, environmental health, vaccines and immunization, substance use, mental health, sexual and reproductive health, and violence and injury prevention. These priority areas correspond to the behavioral and environmental risk factors that contribute most to the leading causes of mortality and morbidity in the Philippines. The Health Promotions and Literacy Longitudinal Study seeks to gather nationally representative data to inform health promotions policies, programs, and interventions at the national and regional level and track progress over time. Next slide, please. The study is also designed to measure the health literacy of Filipinos, and we found that men overall had lower health literacy across these priority areas. In particular, men had lower scores in mental health, substance abuse, sexual and reproductive health, and environmental health, and they also had mixed scores in the rest of the priority areas. So for this presentation, I wanted to zero in on a few examples where we saw a very clear difference in scores between men and women. So 2 of these are in substance abuse, and the one is in vaccination. For substance abuse, we found that more than half of the population drink alcohol, and that males drink alcohol more frequently and have more servings per sitting. We also found that almost a quarter of the population smoked cigarettes or vape in the last 3 months, and that those who did are mostly male. So this led us to a recommendation to the Department of Health to develop materials that are specifically designed for males. Since most of those who drank alcohol and smoked cigarettes are male, we recommended that in their health campaigns, they highlight diseases that are specific to males, such as decreased fertility, prostate cancer, and erectile dysfunction. For vaccination, the one on the bottom, we found that knowledge of childhood vaccines was lower among men. In contrast to concrete recommendations on health campaigns for substance abuse, for this result, we recommended that we conduct further research to assess how knowledge of parents translates to children getting immunized. This is because when we conducted data collection, we noted that the respondents who are fathers did not provide answers to child vaccines, stating that their wives are responsible or more knowledgeable about it. So given that women are mostly responsible for routine immunization, we suggested that DOH explore further whether improving the knowledge of fathers about vaccine actually results in improved routine immunization of their children in future rounds. So while subgroup analysis is usually a standard feature of data analysis, looking into differences between men and women on health literacy allowed us to question our assumptions to make sure that we're not leaving certain populations behind. And this led to recommendations for health campaigns that target populations that needed the extra nudge towards health-seeking behaviors. So that's it for our experience in the Philippines. I'll now hand the floor back to Sheda to lead us through the next segment of the webinar.
Thank you. Thanks so much for those presentations. Let me now, Miko, keep you on the panel and then also invite back Diksha and Priyavi. And also I wanted to introduce a new speaker, Nakubayana Mugamba, who's the manager of ID Insight. And of course, Sarah, we're happy to have you stay with us. So I'm sure there are lots of questions that I saw in the chat, and thank you for answering those. Particularly, Diksha, there were some questions for you, and at the one of them, which was the oversampling, I didn't have a chance to read your response. That maybe we could start very quickly with you responding to that oversampling question, and then I'll come back to some specific questions that I have for you, for the speakers. Thank you.
Sure. So as I mentioned in my chat, I think we do look at oversampling as well, I won't say oversampling as much as augmenting the sample when we have specific subgroups of interest that we want to represent in the data at a high precision level. So usually using our existing sample frames, the way that we approach this might be for voter rolls, we might, oversample the number of households that we want to enroll so that we can go to a higher number of households to find the specific subgroups of interest that we want to go to. When we talk about grid-based sampling, since we already are listing all households in a geographical area, during the listing exercise, we already collect a lot of the demographic information and then are able to specifically target our selection if needed for those specific subgroups. And then, as I mentioned, even in the example, when we needed a specific subgroup to be represented at a higher precision, then we also included in dual sample frames to be able to then bring those in to give us a higher sample number than what might be represented in the existing sample frames of each. I think we usually take an approach of looking at what is the subgroup of interest and what are the margin of errors that we are comfortable with, and then using those two parameters, we go ahead and look at what other approaches we need to be including it.
Thank you. Thanks, Diksha. That's wonderful. I also encourage others who have any questions to put it in the chat. General questions for the whole group, for ID Insight team, or specific question to any of our experts. But let me just ask some questions that I have for the panelists from our side. I wanted to start with Mika. Mika, I have a question for you. In your experience, have you found any specific strategies that enable effective surveying on women?
Thank you so much for that question, Shada. So I think compared to the other countries that are represented here today, so India and Kenya, I think I would consider the Philippines an outlier in terms of gender issues, and this is definitely translated in our experience in our data collection projects, as evidenced by the very high proportion of female enumerators in our field team. As Priyavi demonstrated earlier, we have more than 75% of our field team are women. In our sample, we also had a very high proportion of female respondents. But what we've learned so far from our experience is that the presence of more female enumerators has made it less challenging for us to ask sensitive questions, particularly on mental health and sexual and reproductive health, and especially in more conservative areas in the country. So for example, we had some areas where we had to pair up a male and female enumerators, and male enumerators would usually be in charge of coordination and logistical and safety arrangements, but female enumerators would be in charge of talking to our respondents because our respondents would be more comfortable speaking with them.
Thank you. Thanks for that response. Priyavi, I'm coming to you now for a question. Based on your research, are there any links between enumerators' gender and data quality?
Thank you. So through our analysis, we have observed some links between enumerator gender and data quality. We analyzed the relationship between enumerator gender and data quality by dividing it into two categories, questions that are gender sensitive, questions that are not typically gender sensitive, and the respondent group among male respondents, female respondents. And what we observed was that the relationship between enumerator gender and data quality is the strongest when we have when we're asking gender sensitive questions to female respondents. These could be questions about menstrual health, sexual health, reproductive health, prenatal care, any form of violence, trust in community, social norms. For questions like these, we have found that female respondents in particular are more willing to take the question and answer it to a female enumerator as opposed to their male counterparts. By answering it, I mean, in all of our survey questions, we have options for them to refuse to answer that particular question or to say, I don't know. And we have found that both these rates are significantly lower when it's a female enumerator who is asking the question. So that is where the relationship is the strongest. In other permutations and combinations, which is questions which are not gender sensitive being asked to female respondents, to male respondents, or gender sensitive questions being asked to male respondents, we have found that women enumerators perform at par with their male counterparts. In our analysis, on average, we found they perform slightly better, but that difference is not statistically significant. This is irrespective of how they have been hired. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thanks, Priyavi. I think everyone who's joined this webinar today is very interested in this. So I really appreciate the work that you and ID Insight have done. And big thanks to Sarah for putting the links to some of the blogs and some of the material that we all need to look at. You have a beautiful website, by the way. Last night I was looking at it and I find myself really impressed with not just how you put it together, but also really the substance. Let me come to you now, to Nakubayana. We really are interested in your experience from ID Insight and what you have done on the sort of the surveyed enumerators in Africa last year. What insight did you garner from the experience of female enumerators on the continent?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so we've heard a little bit about enumerator data in other contexts, and we did carry out an exercise where we surveyed enumerators on the African continent, but we didn't just talk to female enumerators, but we also spoke to male enumerators as well, in order to get a sense of the different experiences that the two genders have and the different perceptions of these experiences. So I'll just share some of the findings that we had, but there's more that can be shared if it comes up during discussion. I've already seen a question in the chat about age being a factor in enumerator hiring. So one thing we found from the demographics in Africa is that we found that men were on average 5 years older, came from larger households, and were more likely to be married and have children compared to the female enumerators that were hired. And this likely reflects the fact that data collection work is more challenging for older females who've got children and would therefore likely have greater household responsibilities, which would keep them from engaging in survey work. We also found that some of the top reasons that people went into survey work were similar across both genders. So most of them stated that they wanted to learn a new skill, serve the community, or generally found the job interesting. But one thing that we did find statistically significant, difference there, was that men were more likely to say that they took up the job because it had good pay. So about 32% of males who were surveyed compared to 18% of females say that they took up the job because of the good pay. Now, these differences may reflect some gender biased economic realities. So for the most part, across the African continent, men are normally the head of households and therefore are likely focused on financial remuneration because they have to provide for the family, whereas females are more likely to take up the job of being a surveyor because of the flexibility that it can offer, being able to do it part-time and accommodates homemaking responsibilities. Another finding that we had was that when it comes to leadership and promotion, once people are working as surveyors, we found that a lot of women say that they were less likely to apply for various leadership roles, such as being a field manager, even if they were qualified for the position. And that is partly because they felt like men are better suited to take on these roles, given the demanding nature of the positions that are required. Female respondents also the female surveyors also said that there were situations in which men had greater access to communities compared to females, especially when you're going into different communities and certain spaces like that, where there's a difference which is given to men compared to women, and therefore they felt that men were generally better suited for those types of positions. Lastly, when it comes to feeling a sense of respect during data collection, a lot more women said that they did not feel as respected by the respondents during data collection. So 18% of females compared to only 3% of males said that they did not feel respected by respondents. And when we did ask what do people generally do when they're not working as surveyors, most of them mentioned that they essentially work in self-employment, so doing their own businesses, but also for women, they would obviously, they would normally have greater household responsibilities, so they might defer back to taking care of their households. Those are some of the highlights of the findings that we had. Sarah has shared a blog post for some of the findings from India, and we can discuss more of this as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nakubiana. While you were telling us all this amazing experience that you have from the continent, we've also got a couple of questions in the chat, which I think is for you and Priyavi. One is on are these enumerators permanent field workers, and do they have driver's license? And these can be barriers to entry. That's one question. The other question is on the follow-up questions on enumerators' gender, and asking whether there's a specific training for male enumerators to become more gender or inclusive enumerators. Can I turn to you, Priyavi, and then maybe come back to you, Nakubiana, for answering that question?
Thank you. So to answer the question about enumerators being permanent field workers, we usually hire enumerators on short to medium-term contracts for specific projects. So they're not permanent employees or workers with the organization. About driving licenses, so in India, we did have a requirement for enumerators to have access to a motorbike and driving licenses to ensure they can commute to the location. However, recognizing that it presents a systematic disadvantage to candidates from marginalized backgrounds, we are now in the process of relaxing that requirement, of not having it as a requirement anymore. We have already done that for some of our projects, and instead we are now relying increasingly upon either public transport or for renting autos or cars for our enumerators. So I hope that answers that question. About training for male enumerators, all enumerators who are hired, all candidates actually who make it to the training stage go through the exact same training irrespective of their gender or any other criteria. So they go through the same training sessions and the same field pilots, post which their performance is analyzed and they're recruited to be a part of the team. So hope that answers the question.
Very good, thank you. Coming to you, Nakubiana, anything else to add to those questions, to those answers from?
Not too much to add. I think Priyavi covers the process for across ID Insight. I might add, though, that in the African context, we generally do not require a driver's license, for example, for hiring, and that's mostly because we usually hire field cars for the enumerators to get around, or they will use public transport if they're required to do that on their own. So that hasn't really been a barrier across the continent, which might be a bit different from the Indian context.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm now coming, there's this question that's coming back again on the source of the data for the enumerators, female enumerators in India. What, if anyone can answer that from the ID Insight, that would be great, either in the chat or right now.
So I've answered it in the chat, but happy to voice it over as well. All statistics in the hiring part of our presentation, so which is hiring and the data quality implications of any change in hiring processes, are specific to DataDelta ID Insight. So the 25% statistic is that on average, that was the composition, the gender composition of our enumerator teams within the organization. Similarly for Philippines and across Africa. So it's internal to the organization.
Very
And
good.
just one thing I wanted to flag to the earlier question about training. We also do provide training, mandatory training for all candidates on safety, security, sexual harassment, the processes that are to be followed in case anybody wishes to file an official complaint, or even general grievance redressal mechanisms. So we actually devote 2 days of our training to make our candidates familiar with our internal processes.
Thank you. Thank you, Pravi. I think we have another question, but we'll get back to on that one. I think is what is a major challenge, aside maybe from funding. We'll come back to that in a second. Let me now go to Diksha. I have a very important question for Diksha. I've been really interested to ask her. Diksha, we've talked a lot about primary surveys, but of course, administrative data is very important for decision making. How can we apply a gender intentional approach to administrative data sets?
Great. Thank you for that question. And it's something I'm very excited to talk about also. I think, of course, as we've been talking a lot about, making primary surveys more gender intentional, we should not forget that a large part of decision making within governments is done using administrative and programmatic data. That is data that is collected through service delivery, through transactions between the state and the citizens, and data that is generated through those processes. And at DataDelta, one of the things that we are trying to do, in addition to the work on primary surveys, is also to see how we can support both governments and social sector organizations in making this form of data, administrative and programmatic, also more gender inclusive. And we're doing this through 3 steps. I think the first is to, when we identify a specific department or a program that wants to take on this approach, we first review the theory of change of that program, right? And see if that theory of change is itself has a gender inclusive lens. Have we taken into account the differences in the way programs are accessed by genders and the way that outcomes are generated across genders, and have we taken that lens first and foremost in defining the program pathways itself? Then the second part of it is to actually review the data that is being generated through these systems. At the minimum, it would be to say, do the outcomes, are the data points that are generated, are they even disaggregated by sex? Like that is the bare minimum. But of course, we also push that further to say, does the data even reflect some of the gender differences that we've articulated in the theory of change? How much are there indicators which are more specific to certain gender groups and their interactions with the system? We also look at how the data is being generated and are there any biases within that? So for example, a lot of the administrative data sets, for instance, is collected through, say, phone surveys. And we know that in countries like India, there is still a huge digital divide where women don't have access to phones or are not owners of phones. And hence data that is collected is inherently biased. So how can we address that? And then in the third step, what we look at is actually providing actionable recommendations on ways to kind of pivot to a more gender inclusive system. And those recommendations kind of take into account a lot of the practices we spoke about today on how are you reaching to your beneficiaries or to the program participants? How do you collect that data? What kind of indicators are you collecting on? Who is collecting that data? Are there power dynamics, gender disparities within that collection? And then, of course, how do you even analyze, process, and compile that data to generate insights that can be helpful in your administrative decision making? So not only are we, of course, suggesting this in a longer pathway of independent data, but ensuring that even within administrative systems, this lens continues to stay on top of mind and is taken into account in every step.
Thank you. Thanks, Diksha. Yes, that's super, super important. And I'm so glad that ID Insight, not only you're practicing it, but also, you're sharing a lot of your experience in the field. So I'm looking to see whether there are any other questions. There was a question about the challenges overall, and aside from funding, and also I think there was a question on, and maybe I have a question on how can NSOs actually, adapt these learnings for their own work and kind of integrate it into their gender data collection and analysis. If any of the panelists would like to respond to that, both on the overall challenges, but also how can we take this learning and try to mainstream it into the National Statistical Office? Please come forward. Anyone wants? Why don't I start with you, Mika? Do you want to answer any of those two questions?
Sorry, Shada, I lost you for like 10 seconds. Like, can you repeat the question?
I put out two questions, and you pick any of them that you want. One is generally on the challenges aside from funding, but of course, if there are any tips and tricks on that one, yes. What are the main challenges that we are facing in this field? And the other one is how can we get these learnings and these practices much more adopted by the NSOs and mainstreamed into the gender data work of the countries?
Yeah, thank you so much, Shada. So I think like I'd want to answer the second one. I think the reason why we're able to do all of these things within DataDelta is because of intentionality. Like I think the organization has really prioritized like all of these initiatives that have been shared by our team. And I think that in order to do all of these things, like within national statistics offices, like there has to be intentionality, and there also has to be a champion for initiatives such as these. And I feel like that's exactly what the DataDelta team has been doing within ID Insight, making sure that we have that we're able to create pathways for female enumerators to participate more, or that that we also encourage gender disaggregated analysis, or that we're employing all of these innovative strategies that Diksha has already also shared. Yeah. So that's two things, like intentionality and having a champion to push for these things.
Great. Anyone else wants to add to that? Particularly the issue of how do we get it integrated into the national statistical offices and the learnings, aside from the important session we've had today with our GDN members.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Sarah, please.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was actually going to respond to the question about challenges, because I think even when we have intentionality and we have champions, there are challenges. And I think one of the things that Priyavi started to allude to is if you change your hiring practices, or you reduce, for example, the barrier to entry associated with having a motorbike and a driver's license. And so then you need to either rely on public transit, or you need to hire cars or autos to take folks around. That has a budget implication. If you are lowering your barriers to entry in terms of previous work experience, and you have to respond by increasing number of training days for your field teams, that has a budget implication. And so one of the things that we have to work with on our partners and funders is the value of making these changes. It does have a budget implication, but you get better data quality, you get more equity and justice in your teams. But a lot of our partners and clients are very budget sensitive. And so there's an ongoing education process about the additional value of spending incrementally more to ensure that you have balanced teams that are well protected and supported, and what that means for the quality of the data that they're receiving, and what it means for kind of the ethics and equity of the hiring practices of their partner organization. So I think that regular awareness raising and openness about these budget implications is an important, A, it's a challenge, and B, it's an important part of kind of getting the adoption. We all know that data in our countries is underfunded. And so every incremental increase in budget is a barrier. But we really feel like with the analysis that we've done, we're able to make the case for the value of that slight additional budget expenditure. And then I wanted to flag, after you go, Diksha, to ask Nakubiana to please respond to one of the questions in the chat about respect for respondents and the aspects of dignity in the relationship between enumerator and respondent. Nakubiana is also part of ID Insight's Dignity Initiative, and there's a lot of thinking about this. So I was hoping that you could weigh in on that after Diksha responds to Sheeta's question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add into what Mika and Sarah have already said, is this whole idea of institutionalization, right? I think that is always a hard ask, and I think it requires buy-in across multiple levels, and really being able to imbibe the idea that gender data is useful and can have, and that the cost benefit kind of understanding that yes, it might require additional resources to make it happen, but the benefit of collecting gender data goes a long way. And I think a few things that I've seen as helpful is, one is to kind of look at this as structural problem, to see what kind of structures can we actually input to ensure that there is this constant checks to make sure that gender data is integrated, or the gender data mechanisms are integrated into systems. So not just saying, yes, we're going to do this, and then, the motivation is there, but we need structural changes in terms of accountability, in terms of checks and balances to make sure that this is getting integrated in every step. And secondly, we would also require the right kind of making salient the risks when gender data is not included. So I think more such discussions is definitely helpful in sharing where, how deep the risk is of not collecting gender data. I think that making that salient across the levels again is really useful. And the third thing that I would highlight when we talk about institutionalization is also having the right incentives. Like, we all want to do good, and but of course, just wanting to do good is not enough motivation always. I think also looking at what other incentives can be put in place to help ensure that this is well integrated into systems becomes really important.
Thank you, Diksha. That's really everything you said. I couldn't agree more. Over to you, Nakubiana. I'm running out of time, so a quick response to this question would be amazing. Thank you.
Sure. I couldn't find the exact question, but I will speak to respectfulness and dignity as we think about it at ID Insight. Essentially, as Diksha has mentioned in her comment, we do include a component in our training about respect for respondents and ensuring that they're feeling comfortable during any interaction, and also reiterating the consent aspect of the interview. So they can pull out at any point. They are free to not answer any questions if they do not feel comfortable to do so, and so on and so forth. But even more broadly, when it comes to respecting the dignity of the respondents, we do understand that often data collection can be a fairly extractive exercise where people are going in to garner information from communities. And sometimes there's things which they get back, and sometimes they are given promises, especially if it's a control group, and they may not get the returns that they might imagine that would come to them. So one thing that we do advocate for projects to think about as they're doing data collection is really engaging communities from the beginning, even before data collection starts, to really understand whether this program that we are suggesting is something that the community actually wants, whether it is going to answer the questions that they need, and how to best engage them in order to make them really feel part of the process. And even at the end of the process, oftentimes when we have extracted this data, sometimes we forget to go back to share with the communities our finding, even though we might have promised that during data collection. So at ID Insight, we have started system of, at a minimum, sharing our findings with the enumerators so that they understand what came out of the data that they collected. And we want to use that as a building block to sharing with the communities that we have been collecting data from, in order to make them feel more a part of the process and feel like they are understanding the point of this exercise. I'll stop there in the interest of time, but yeah, the Dignity Initiative is another arm of ID Insight that really likes to focus on how we can do development work and data collection in a way that upholds the dignity of the people that we seek to serve. Thank you.
That's wonderful, and a really wonderful message towards the end of this webinar. I wish we had more time. We're really running out of time, and we're having some really good questions coming in, but I don't think we have time to specifically answer those. I was going to give a challenge to Sarah for giving us the concluding remarks, but maybe fold in a couple of the last questions that are coming in, particularly the question on the incentives and how can we incentivize partners and donors and others to be much more into this inclusive data collection and analysis. So over to you, Sarah, for wrapping us up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shada. And wow, thank you all for such great questions. So the two things I would say here is a lot of the analysis that we've been able to conduct and kind of follow our curiosity about these questions around gender integration and equity, particularly in enumerator hiring. These are studies we've been able to do because we have resources from Co-Impact to support DataDelta. And the beauty, as we all know, of having some flexible resource to really invest in the kinds of questions that are not associated with a given project, but really matter for your operations and for your values as an institution. We had some dedicated funding from Co-Impact to be able to do that. So that's enabled the research that Priyavi has described. It's enabled some investment in building out what it might look like to do gender evidence units for administrative data. Like, we've really had some running room, which has been huge. And I think now that we have that learning, we are able to bring that into our other projects going forward. So just want to give a shout out to Co-Impact and to kind of the spirit of having some flexible funding to really interrogate these things. But then to Judy's question about incentives, one of the other pieces of work that we've done with support from Co-Impact and with our colleague Shreya Moore, who's not with us today, is to figure out how to support our teams to bring gender orientation and an equity orientation into the very early stages of project and program design. Even when we have government partners or nonprofit partners who are not thinking from a gender equity lens, we want to help them get there in terms of why it matters to be more gender sensitive in our enumeration teams and in the data we collect and in the data analysis. And one of the ways that we do that is start by interrogating what impact are they trying to achieve? What decisions are they trying to make? What questions are they trying to answer? And then tying back questions of representation, equity, gender, intersectionality into kind of in an instrumental way for what they're trying to achieve. And we do that, I'm sorry to say, not by coming out of the gates with like gender equity matters, but rather really interrogating what matters to them. and then helping them see why they won't be able to achieve their goals unless they can really pull apart what are the differential experiences by subgroups, or who are the people that your programs are targeting? Well, if you don't get information about them, you're going to leave them behind, or you're not going to allocate your resources well. So we try as much as possible to align the incentives with what partners are trying to achieve themselves. And partners vary, as we all know. We have some partners that say to us, we know we're asking really gender sensitive questions, so we want to put extra money and resources behind getting enumeration teams that are balanced. And we have some people who don't think about it at all. In the case in the Philippines, there wasn't an upfront discussion with the Department of Health about some of these gender equity dynamics, but our team then brought that into the analysis. So there's a lot of entry points. You've got to find your entry points with your partners, but in general, the rule of thumb, as with everything in life, is understand what your partners are trying to achieve and then build your case in favor of what they're trying to achieve. So let me just close out with an enormous thanks to our team, to Mika, Diksha, Nakubiana, and Previ for your excellent presentations, to Sheda for inviting us, to all of you for caring about this topic, to Jay and Lorene for supporting our preparation and execution of today. What a thrill to be with you. We are delighted to be part of a broader community of folks who care about gender equity and gender data, and we would love to partner with any of you or just continue the shared learning together. This has really been fun, and I can't wait to read the rest of the chat. It's flowing in. You guys are full of energy and questions. It's really fun to engage with you. So thanks so much, everyone.
And thanks to you, Sarah, for all your energy. And just, I wish I was there with you in Kenya and hug you and, and hug everybody. And really a big thanks. It's just been an amazing webinar. Really appreciate it. For those of you, and also to our audience, you've been just great. If you're interested in GDN, please look up our website. I also really encourage you to look at the ID Insight and DataDelta work that they have done. And stay tuned for our future webinars. And I'm not sure whether it's going to be as good as today's, but we'll try. So thank you so much and have a great rest of the day. Be safe and go for equity. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.